Well, my thanks to the organizers for this opportunity to share with you some of the concerns that I raise in my just published book, and to all of you for having come to listen and discuss. The starting point of my book is the conundrum that although we all know how important food is, somehow we've landed ourselves with a global food system that generates hunger alongside of obesity, climate change, waste. And somehow public responsibility has been sold out to markets and corporations, while the frontline actors of food security, families, communities, small-scale producers, have been disempowered. So my book tries to take a look at how this has happened and what we can do about it. And my basis for thinking I might have something to say about it, as Juliette mentioned, is above all my own experience in 4 decades in the food world on the interface between African villages and UN meeting halls, and my often difficult efforts to make sense of it. So this is the terrain that I'm going to try to cover briefly this evening. And I'd like to start with just a few dates in the post-war history of international institutional food security governance. In 1944, FAO was established to fight hunger, but the basic measures that the first Director General, Lord Boyd Orr, advocated to be able to privilege people's needs over commodity traders' profits were opposed by Britain and, guess who? US, and the commodity traders, of course. A major food crisis in the mid-70s motivated the convening of a World Food Conference, which, however, continued to avoid the real issues, the need to establish global food reserves, to regulate agricultural trade. The term Washington Consensus was coined in 1989. It's shorthand for the package of neoliberal structural adjustment policies imposed on developing countries, opening up their markets, deregulation, reducing state support to agriculture, whereas the US and the EU continue to support alla grande, as we say in Italy. In 1995, the World Trade Organization came on the scene and gave a further push towards opening developing country markets and promoting corporate concentration in the food system. By 2005, the system was creaking. The WTO grinds to a halt in Hong Kong on the agriculture package. 2007, 2008, the food price crisis. And 2009, the reform of the Committee on World Food Security, which we'll spend a bit of time looking at to see if it might be something different. But I'd like to draw just a couple of lessons from this rapid historical review. The first is that the same problems are still with us. Food is more than a commodity was Lord Boyd Orr's parting thrust when he resigned from FAO in frustration in 1948. And it's a slogan of the food sovereignty movement today. And what has been consistently lacking is political commitment to long-term public collective goals as opposed to short-term particular national or private interests. So a reaction of outrage is understandable, but it's not enough. We need to be able to read beneath the rhetoric and understand the interests at play so that we can seize opportunities for change. And one of the instruments that can help us is food regime analysis. It's a big picture political economy look that Juliette referred to at how world capitalism has organized agriculture in order to enhance commercial profits. There have been different phases in which different actors have played the central organizing role, the British Empire, the US, and post-World War II, and then handing over gradually to the agri-food corporations. Now, these regimes emerge out of contests between these powerful actors and social movements whereby some kind of equilibrium is established. And the rules by which they operate seem natural, just the way things are, until the equilibrium starts to break down. And this is a moment when the equilibrium is breaking down, so questions can and should be asked. So let's take a look at what the two contenders, the corporate regime actors and the social movements, have to say for themselves. Over the past 2 decades, there's been an astounding concentration of the power of transnational agri-food corporations. And this is not to be established to the inevitable march of history, but to the rules that have been put in place, such that the 5 largest traders in grain control 75% of the international market. In the multinational input industry, the top 3 countries alone claim almost 50% of the global propriety seed market that they're allowed to patent under the intellectual property rights that reward corporations for the resources they invest in laboratory research, but ignore the far more substantial efforts of billions of anonymous farmers in their fields and the need to guarantee their rights to use and exchange their own seeds. The retail market is the latest arrival in the corporate-controlled food system. Supermarket chains have moved into the global south, aided by the global policies that have opened these economies to unregulated foreign investment. Just to give you a ballpark figure, the number of Walmarts in Mexico has risen from 14 in 1994 to 1,724 in 2012. Corporations exercise their power and their influence over the global food system, not only through the sheer size and capacity to control prices, but also by the increasingly important role they've come to play in the regulation of the food system through the rise of private standards and the decline of the state's regulatory role. And finally, of course, the agri-food businesses expend enormous amounts of money in seeking to influence consumer choice and public opinion. The California referendum decision on GMO labeling. An important issue for academia, and not only, is the impact of funding sources like the Gates Foundation, whose grants to Harvard University have produced such products as Robert Paulberg's passionate plea for allowing Africa to profit from biotechnology in the name of science. Another class of actors that has entered into the globalized food system more recently is speculative financial capital, which abstracts food from its physical form into highly complex derivatives that are hard to understand for all but the most expert, making accountability a very difficult task. The corporate-led food regime relies on a global market organized in a way that favors its operations. It's estimated that only about 12% of all food actually transits through the global market. Yet the impacts of the way it's organized and the speculation it permits are visited on the local food systems of countries whose share in the global market is minimal, but who've been sucked into it by structural adjustment and trade regulations, in Africa above all. So if you ask the question, who benefits from global free trade, and the question, who benefits, is one you have to ask always, the only voices that maintain it's a win-win-win-win paradise are the agribusiness corporations, Global Harvest in this case, whereas FAO documents the fact that the winners are the rich and the losers, surprise, surprise, are the poor. So what is the impact of the corporate food regime on small-scale food producers? The global food chain is intimately linked to an industrialized model of agricultural production because of its logic and scale and the interests that drive it. Small-scale producers are being pushed off the land to make room for corporate-controlled plantations. An alternative is contract farming, whereby small-scale producers are linked to corporation-led value chains. But it's not that much better. They're left on their land, but they shoulder the climatic and all of the other multiple risks that agriculture involves, while at the same time they're subjected to corporate control over what they plant, when and how, and what prices they receive. So they lose the autonomy, which is the basis of their resilience. And then corporate value chains have a funny way of rewarding everybody else more than the primary producers. You can see here the example of the cocoa chain. And they also beg the question of just what is being valued in a value chain and who decides. Yet, the corporate narrative assumes that the future for small-scale family farmers lies in linking up with industrial food chains for those few who would manage to do so, and becoming advanced farmers, while the rest will be migrated out of agriculture in the elegant formulation of the Syngenta Foundation, which produced this graph. Where to? That's somebody else's problem, not the corporations. So what do those directly concerned think about this narrative? Let's shift to these small-scale food producers and peasant movements, and they are not an archaic minority. We're talking about some 3 billion family farmers, pastoralists, fisher folk, indigenous peoples, urban farmers, producing most of the world's food. And they have not been taking the corporate grab lying down. Rural people have been organizing, particularly over the past 2 decades, around the world in reaction to the impacts of neoliberal policies, starting at the local level, then building up to the national, the regional. And the need to reach the global level became increasingly evident with the advent of the WTO in 1995. In fact, the best known and largest global peasant network, La Via Campesina, that I'm sure you've all heard of, was born in 1993. The World Food Summits were called by FAO in 1996 and 2002, and above all, the parallel civil society forums provided a strong impetus for the global networking of these movements. And that was due above all to a deliberate political choice on the part of the organizers of the forums to put rural social movements in the majority and in the decision-making role in formulating civil society positions, unlike in other UN processes in which NGOs, non-governmental organizations, tend to dominate. And there is a very important distinction to be made between NGOs and what we could call people's organizations created by and mandated to speak for these sectors of the population. These are issues of legitimacy, representation. The social movements have progressively developed their own alternative paradigm to green revolution technology, modernization, free trade, food sovereignty. How many of you have heard the term food sovereignty? Just about everybody. In 1996, this concept was introduced to the Civil Society Forum. Nobody knew what they were talking about at that time, but by 2002, it had become the battle cry of the Assembly. And the social movements also established a congenial network to carry forward their engagement with global institutions. As you can imagine, it's not so easy for peasant organizations and artisanal fisher folk to interact with UN bureaucrats and governments. And so the International Planning Committee for Food Sovereignty is their network. It's the network that they are in the lead, with NGOs playing a support role. And over the past decade, the IPC has opened up political space for rural movements in global FAO policy forums where they'd never set foot before. Over 2,500 representatives of peasants, artisanal fisher folk, etc., championing a food security, a food sovereignty agenda. And as you can imagine, this means not just buying airline tickets, but a lot of coaching, capacity building, so that the space could be occupied in an effective manner. So let's look at what they're proposing as against the corporate global food system. The term local in local food webs can mean different things in different contexts, from within a day's walk from the village to national or regional as opposed to global. But in any event, it highlights the dimension of control by the people of a territory over a series of factors that escape their control with globalization. While the term web contrasts with the image of a chain and emphasizes the interconnections of all the different actors in a food system. In the global north, initiatives to reconnect consumers to sources of healthy food are proliferating, and I know here as well as elsewhere. And in the global south, the dominance of small-scale family farming and local food webs is simply overwhelming. Family farms produce over 70% of Brazil's food supplies on much less land than the quote-unquote modern agribusinesses have. And in Africa, family farms represent 80% of all farms and meet up to 80% of the food needs of the continent. Worldwide, it's estimated that the peasant food web produces some 70% of the total food, yet the support that they receive from the public sector is minimal. Building blocks of food systems that are alternative to the corporate system, these are essentially the pillars of the food sovereignty agenda, are being put in place locally throughout the world. People are fighting to defend their access to and control over water, land, biodiversity, not just through protest, but through concrete action. For example, to save and multiply threatened native seed. Agroecological models of production are being reivindicated. In 2003, the few people in FAO who were interested in agroecology had to congregate in the corridors and whisper because they were so counter-mainstream. Whereas last September, an important seminar on agroecology for the first time was organized in FAO, and the Director General got up and said, today a window was opened in what for 50 years has been the cathedral of the Green Revolution. And I mention this to indicate, particularly to the younger people in this room, that change is possible. It can take time and needs perseverance, but it can happen. The toughest area of all is markets, because of the domination of the single idea of the market. And instead, the world is full of markets which decentralize the encounter between food supply and food demand, and which correspond to criteria other than profit alone. Another important pillar of the food sovereignty agenda is approaches to research and to generating knowledge that build on and enhance local knowledge. In my book, I look briefly at the two contrasting food systems and how they impact on major global challenges like maintaining dwindling biodiversity. You probably have all heard of the recent case of the GMOs contaminating landrace maize in Mexico, where corn was born. Protecting the health of the population. More people globally suffer from overweight and obesity than hunger. And combating food waste. FAO estimates that 30% of the food produced each year is wasted. Addressing climate change. So, when you add it all up, there's no doubt whatsoever as to which approach to food provisioning scores best. The fallback argument for supporters of the global corporate food chains is that whether we like it or not, only industrial agriculture can double food production by 2050 to feed the world's growing population. This thesis rests on several questionable assumptions. The first is that the world's population will inevitably soar beyond 9 billion by 2050, ignoring the fact that the average family size worldwide has dropped by about half over the last 40 years and will drop more the more women are empowered. So you have a choice between investing in GMOs or in women's empowerment. The second questionable assumption is that it will be indispensable to double food production, whereas there's overwhelming evidence that the present food supply is more than adequate today and will be tomorrow. So the problem is not one of technical attention to productivity, but of political will to solve the unequal and inequitous access to food in our system. And finally, the corporate narrative assumes that industrial high-tech agriculture is indeed more productive than agroecological family farming. And this is a false thesis of which a recent study published in December by a group of UC Berkeley researchers is just the latest in rebuttal. So if we consider how much food is wasted every year, we can recognize that our problem is ill-used surplus rather than scarcity. We need to change the system, not to accelerate it dangerously. And in conclusion, it's the smiling woman in the center of the slide who has the answer, not the dour gentleman around the market. Alternative building is grounded in local situations, but it's progressively reaching outward building alliances and networking, not only upwards, and of course hierarchical ordering is a mania of ours, but also horizontally. And these alliances include those with local governance. The impact of policies and programs from above on alternative building is far too often negative. Just think of the WTO. But this need not be the case. Alternative food governance can build up from the base. The food policy councils that are spreading around the country, citizens retaking food provision back into their hands. And national policies too can empower people. I don't know how many of you know about the Zero Hunger program in Brazil, whereby public funding is used to purchase agroecologically produced food from family farmers, and this is used for school feeding programs, hospital feeding, etc., etc. So this rapid review is intended as a reminder that concrete action is underway around the world to build more equitable and sustainable food systems. So changes in paradigms and regulations and resource allocation at the global level could make a difference. An authoritative report published by the Committee on World Food Security recently underlines the fact that transformations in agriculture are the result of explicit or more often implicit political choices, and that appropriate policies can only result from transparently determined political processes that involve smallholder organizations. So there's an issue of who decides and on what basis. The ancient Greeks called on oracles to complement philosophical reasoning. Contemporary decision makers instead consider that they can count on scientific information and statistical data to provide them with quote-unquote objective grounds for what is termed evidence-based policy. To what degree is this assumption justified? It's clear that evidence is framed by the paradigms that are adopted, like productivism, the assumptions that are made, the questions that are asked, the data that is looked for and available, indicators used. A recent study on sustainable food systems in Africa that I'm proud to have been associated with, that was undertaken by the regional small-scale food producers organizations themselves, found that statistics only exist about commercial commodity and export markets, not about the forms of informal markets and exchange which provide food for most of the people in the continent. They are invisible. And when we brought these researchers to FAO to dialogue with the experts red-facedly said, "We're sorry, we just don't have information on what you're talking about." So information derives from what is recorded, and it embodies an assumption about what is worthy of being recorded. This kind of objective evidence acts against political accountability because it lets the decision makers, the politicians, off the hook, and against value-based political debate. We end up with, that's the way it is, just look at the evidence, rather than this is what we want as a society. And this is the significance of the reform of the Committee on World Food Security. It's the first ever global food policy forum in which small-scale producers are at the table and their evidence has to be listened to. The food price crisis in 2007-2008 was highlighted by riots of the kind that make governments sit up and take notice. And so it opened up a window of political opportunity for change that the food sovereignty movement was ready to seize thanks to a decade of networking and capacity building. Otherwise, the opportunity would have passed unseized. The crisis unveiled the deficiencies of the dominant policies and approaches that had been applied, which had transformed Africa from a net food exporter to a net food importer in the space of a decade by pushing its governments to export commodities and purchase cheap food on the market rather than producing it domestically. And it also unveiled a global governance vacuum. In the absence of an authoritative and democratic food security forum, decisions in this important area were being taken by default by actors like these. Considerable efforts were deployed to limit the international community's reactions to a technical, bureaucratic approach. Secretary General Ban Ki-moon set up a high-level task force grouping the secretariats of 23 UN agencies and programs that had something to do with food security, in the admirable objective of better coordination, but with no political oversight. So this is a good illustration of how concern for functional efficiency alone can annul the political dimension of decision-making. And it was accompanied by a hazy donor and investor-driven global partnership which called for more investment, but with no attention to what kind of investment and what kind of agriculture. And then finally, there were those who felt that investment should be guided by policies, not vice versa, and that the policies should be determined inclusively, particularly with the participation of those most affected. And their proposal was to reform the existing but quite ineffectual Committee on World Food Security based in FAO. This last option won out against all odds thanks to an alliance among a number of southern governments above all, FAO, and the social movements who had built up their strength to the global level, as we've seen. So the reform took place during 2009. It was an exceptionally inclusive and transparent process in which the IPC network facilitated participation by rural movements. And I put up here on the slide some of the most important characteristics. All of these were strongly contested and strongly defended by civil society. The fact that the CFS deliberates on food issues from a human rights perspective. Adequate food is an unalienable right, not just a desirable outcome. The fact that everyone is in the room, civil society organizations are recognized as full participants, not observers as elsewhere in the UN system, intervening only at the end when everything has been discussed and decided. And they accompany the Intergovernmental Bureau of the CFS all year round, helping to decide the agenda, draft decision boxes, etc. The private sector is there as well, but it's a separate constituency. It's not confounded with civil society. Decision-making is inclusive and transparent. It takes place in plenary sessions. And at the end of the debate, it's the governments who decide. Civil society wanted it that way because that way the governments can be held accountable. And the reform seeks to build bridges between global policy decisions and what actually happens at the national level and makes a difference in people's lives. One of the important aspects of the reform was the recognition of civil society's right to self-organization, that it shouldn't be the governments who say who could come in the room and who can't and what kind of hats you have to wear, etc., etc. So the resulting mechanism that was self-designed by civil society gives pride of place to organizations directly representing those most affected by food insecurity. There are 11 constituencies, types of organizations, and 10 of them are different kinds of small-scale food producers: peasants, fisher folk, indigenous peoples, agricultural workers, the landless, urban poor, and only the last, the 11th, are the NGOs who elsewhere are the dominant voice. So, on paper, there's never been anything like this before, but what does it look like in practice? I'm going to focus on investment in agriculture and related land issues because they're at the heart of the contest between the two different food systems that we looked at very briefly. From the very beginning, civil society has been conducting a battle in the CFS to obtain recognition that small-scale food production and local food systems are the most modern, effective, sustainable response to today's challenges and to win policy support for them. When the phenomenon of land grabbing hit the headlines in 2008, there were two opposing responses from the international community. The G8 asked the World Bank to develop principles for responsible agricultural investment, PRI, which are essentially a whitewashing of land grabbing because they welcome large-scale investments, including with acquisition of land as an opportunity. There's no reference whatsoever to human rights. There was no consultative process at all behind it. And the alternative was a proposal to negotiate guidelines on the governance of tenure to natural resources coming out of a decade of social movement advocacy. The very first session of the Reformed Committee on World Food Security in October of 2010 had these two options on the table. And there was an acrimonious debate that went on until 3 a.m. one morning. And at the end, the committee agreed to negotiate the guidelines of tenure and refused to rubber stamp the PRI, despite strong pressure from some G8 governments, and decided instead to launch its own consultation within the Committee on World Food Security on what principles need to be put in place if your objective is to ensure that investment in agriculture promotes food security and smallholders and not corporate profits. And obviously the participation of social movements and civil society was fundamental in obtaining these decisions. So the tenure guidelines were the subject of intense negotiations, 2 years of consultations. As always, there were wins and losses, but these are the first ever global guidelines on this delicate issue of land tenure. They're based on principles of universal human rights. They're strong on a number of issues that are very important for the social movements, and they do provide important safeguards against large-scale land acquisitions, alias land grabbing. And these outcomes would not have been possible in a less inclusive and political forum. So, what difference do they make in the field? The G8 and the corporations are paying lip service to the tenure guidelines while continuing to promote privatization of land, and this is not surprising. It's the nature of corporate capitalism. And indeed, global policy and paradigm needs need to be owned and used by the marginalized to make a difference. And that's what the social movements and civil society are seeking to do by putting the tenure guidelines at the service of people's struggles in countries throughout the world at all levels, and not only in the global south. And as I think you all know, there are lots of land issues here in the US. Now, land grabbing is only the most visible aspect of a broader effort to orient investments in agriculture to promote corporate food chains. And thanks in good part to social movement and civil society engagement, it has been possible to make significant progress in changing the terms of the debate in the Committee on World Food Security. It was officially recognized in CFS policy debates in 2013 that it's the small-scale producers, not governments, not corporations, who are responsible for the vast majority of the investment made in agriculture. You can tell what line that is. And what's more, that investment is not just monetary. We tend to equate investment with money, but it's not. It's knowledge, it's labor, it's intelligence, and it's investment that farmers make on their land day by day. They're also responsible for producing most of the food that meets the demand of the world's population. And yet they also constitute the majority of the food insecure. So it doesn't take 3 PhDs to understand that the only conceivable winning strategy to promote food security is to support and defend small-scale producers' own investments. It was hoped that this, what we call normative guidance, this policy guidance, could be strengthened through the negotiation of responsible agricultural investment principles, RIE. This is the CFS response to the PRI that I mentioned earlier. But in the end, the RIE were even more strongly contested than the earlier policy debates for several reasons. First of all, the principles are a more visible, authoritative output than simple policy recommendations. And secondly, the big powers were fighting harder because of the mounting significance of the Committee on World Food Security as a policy forum, and because they were mad at the cumulative gains that civil society had been making, so they really mustered their forces and went out for it. And as a result, the civil society non-negotiable, what's known in negotiation language as red lines, they're non-negotiable, which are up here on the slide, they were crossed on several occasions, and it was judged by civil society that the RAI are really not what we wanted. They're inadequate on several points, inadequate emphasis on the human rights framework, although it's there, but in particular, trade comes out a bit too strongly. They're not strong enough in terms of support for peasant-based production and on public policies and investment to support small-scale producers. But despite that, it is acknowledged that the RAI, the very fact of negotiating them, and the RAI themselves have discredited the RAI. They really have put the PRI, the World Bank PRI, in a corner. And they have introduced some provisions that people's movements can use to good effect. There's talk about the rights of agricultural workers that is not present in other international instruments, and also the responsibilities of governments to make provision for assessing the impacts of investments before they're allowed to take place, and, if worse comes to worse, to ensure grievance mechanisms for the most vulnerable, who of course are those who normally do not have access to any kind of grievance mechanisms. So, the CFS does make a difference in terms of changing the terms of the debate and of generating more progressive, what you could call soft law, normative guidance. But there are big challenges. The products of the CFS are voluntary in order to become in order to become really enforceable, they have to be translated into national legislation. But government accountability leaves a lot to be desired. And in fact, one of the biggest challenges that we face is the ambiguous role of states, who are currently among the worst offenders in terms of promoting narrow and short-sighted objectives, and yet are a basic building block for accountability and for defending citizens' collective interests. So holding governments to account requires building stronger links between global voluntary principles, guidance at the global level, and what really makes the difference, social and political mobilization from below. So finally, where to next? We are, in my view, and not only mine, getting very close to the absolute ecological, socioeconomic, and political limits of today's unsustainable and inequitable food system. The planet is running out of space, even if we didn't run out of patience. Yet the corporations are advocating ever more sophisticated and frightening technologies whereby you can do away with farmers altogether and just let the drones do the work. But there are alternatives. So the big question is, could the food sovereignty movement act as a counterforce, helping to fragment the global domination of the corporate food system in favor of a territorially rooted and governed approach to food provision? And I'd like to close by looking at some of the key issues that need to be addressed in order to empower communities and regulate corporations, markets, and speculators. Obviously, the power of the corporate-private sector is one of the major issues. As Olivier Descoutes, the former special rapporteur on the right to food, points out, it's a taboo, but everyone knows it's a problem. So, are we going to insist on accountable governments, or are we going to go for what I call vaporous multi-stakeholderism, whereby everybody gets into the room without distinguishing who you are, and of course, the corporations come into the room, and since they have the most power and the most money, they tend to elbow everybody else into the corner. we need to reflect more carefully on who should be in the room when these important decisions are being taken. At the national level, should it be only national actors deciding what's best for them, or also foreign donors, multilaterals, corporations? Would we like the Chinese government to sit in the front row of the New York City Council? After all, they do own a hunk of the city. Of course we wouldn't, but that's exactly what happens in Bangladesh when it's a question of deciding whether to promote small-scale diversified agriculture and diets or corporation-manufactured supplements as the best recipe for better nutrition. It's the funders who decide, and you have to have very good eyesight to be able to see a ministry, a Bangladeshi ministry or two in the lineup here of the Scaling Up Nutrition initiative. It's the funders who decide national policy. So there's a confusion of different actors, their roles, their responsibilities, a blurring of decision-making and accountability, and of course, very important power imbalances. And even with the Committee on World Food Security, although you've been able to tell that I'm a fan of it, there are some honest questions that one could ask. Should there be balance between the corporate private sector and actors who represent those most affected by food security? Should they be on the same level in terms of weighing in the discussions? And if the corporations are in the room, is it not necessary to acknowledge and to address potential conflicts of interest? A related issue is the need to debunk public-private partnerships, which are a buzzword of today. They're billed as win-win affairs, yet they most often fail to define the obligations and to regulate the behavior of the private partners. And that brings us to that long disputed word in the US, regulation. And this just is to recall that since the time the Constitution was being drafted that we've had this problem of what government should and shouldn't do. Although it seems to me, you can tell me your views, that the experience of the financial meltdown seems to be starting to make headway against the conviction that the less government you have, the better. There's a lot of talk about corporate social responsibility, but research demonstrates that the uptake of corporate social responsibility really concerns only a minimal part of corporate activities. It's mostly corporations who have a well-known brand name, so they're worried about what the public thinks. And they pick and choose what measures they want to apply in terms of the lowest cost and the highest visibility. One well-known example of a multi-stakeholder platform involving corporate social responsibility is the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. And I'd like you to just take a look at the list of actors who are around the table and tell me who you think might be missing. Is it legible? Can you read it? Mm-hmm. Who's not there at the table? Well, the farmers aren't there because most of them have been expelled in order to set up the plantation, but that's certainly one of them. Who else?
Growers.
Well, you can see growers with their 1%, I think.
15.
Yeah, but those are the big growers. There's no government. One more. Well, I'll tell you. It's the agricultural workers who are being exploited and poisoned with pesticides, and they're not there when the decisions are being made. So much for corporate social responsibility. In fact, the transnational corporations have rights that are backed by hard laws, treaties, free trade agreements, bilateral investment agreements, and strong tools for enforcement. They can even sue states beyond national jurisdiction. But the transnational corporations' obligations are backed only by soft laws, codes of conduct, voluntary guidelines, with no enforcement mechanisms. And this is no longer the strident voice of a group of unreformed radicals. It's common knowledge, or it's becoming more and more common knowledge, I believe. So what to do? And this is an open question. We can reflect on this together. I believe that the international human rights framework, of which, of course, the US was a prime promoter at the beginning, is one good starting point for assigning political responsibility for corporations' behavior. We have the so-called Maastricht principles that were developed in 2012 that detail the obligations of states to ensure that businesses and corporations that are based in their territory respect human rights obligations when they operate outside in other countries. And we now have, since last June, I think, in the Council, the Human Rights Council, a process underway to develop a treaty for binding obligations for transnational corporations. It'll take at least 10 years to get it out, if it ever does, but even getting it in was a big step. But the US has not ratified the UN Covenant on Economic and Social Rights. And even at home, the Dodd-Frank Act that was passed by Congress in 2010 to protect the 99% after the financial meltdown has been castrated by lobbying by corporations and big banks, while the US Supreme Court has abolished limits on the amount of money that corporations can contribute to electoral campaigns in the name of freedom of speech. So these are certainly issues that US citizens can waive to call government to account. We need to do a better job of transforming global normative guidance into national, hard, enforceable regulation, protecting the vulnerable. And in building supportive food governance from the bottom up, it can be done under pressure from citizens. National governments are daring to challenge global rules on issues like using public procurement and food stocks for food security in India, challenging the WTO, or protecting local poultry production in Cameroon from dumped frozen chicken parts, dumped for once from the US, from the EU, not from the US. And this, in my view, is the direction that change will take. It'll come building from the bottom up. That means protecting other societies from the abuse of the powerful. And the US is among the powerful. The US is now trying to export its deregulation of corporation misbehavior to Europe in the context of the transatlantic trade and investment partnership, and to other parts of the world in other agreements. And they're consulting the corporations, but not the public. And this is another issue on which concerned US citizens can act, and I'm very glad to say that the IATP is acting, but there aren't many voices being raised against it. I raised earlier the question of what is and what isn't being valued in a value chain. I believe that working to free ourselves from capital's obsession with profit and getting other values back into the heart of food provision is an important part of the way forward. I'd like to leave the last word to West African peasant leader Mamadou Sissoko, who's been a companion in arms over 3 decades of the experience that I've drawn on in writing this book. The last time we were together, I asked him whether or not he felt hopeful about achieving the kind of change we've been fighting for. And he replied, "You know, Nora, sometimes when we lose a battle, I wonder if we shouldn't just give up. But it doesn't last long. I think about how far we've come and all that's moving today, and I'd like to live for another 100 years. So I will leave you with this hopeful message and incitement to engage, because it's our food system and it's going to take all of us to change it for the better."